The emergency bay doors opened at 11:52 p.m., and the dog came through first. He was a Dutch shepherd, maybe 85 pounds, with a brindle coat the color of dry rust and eyes that moved across the room the way radar sweeps a screen, methodical, complete, missing nothing. The two paramedics who'd brought the gurney in behind him had pressed themselves to either side of the door the moment the dog planted himself in the center of the bay. A nurse dropped an intake tray. A resident backed against the crash cart. The security guard on duty, a young man who'd been on the floor 4 months and considered it an easy posting, put his hand on his radio and went very still, because he understood instinctively that the animal in front of him was not responding to the usual signals. Behind the dog, on the gurney, a man somewhere in his late 60s lay with an oxygen mask already in place and a pressure bandage on his left side that was losing the argument it was having with whatever was underneath it. His color was wrong. His breathing was wrong. The monitors attached during transport were communicating things that required immediate attention, and nobody in that trauma bay could get within 6 feet of him because the dog would not allow it. Then Leila Crowe walked through the doors. She was 32 years old, with dark hair pulled back and the kind of face that defaulted to neutral, not cold, just controlled, the way certain people are controlled when the alternative is something they'd spent a long time learning not to be. She'd been working the night trauma floor at Ridgeline Regional Medical Center for 11 months. She knew which supply carts stuck and which ran smooth, which attending physicians made decisions fast, and which deliberated past the point where deliberating was still useful. She knew the building the way she'd learned every building she'd ever worked in. Exits first, then bottlenecks, then angles of approach. She looked at the dog for exactly 3 seconds. She read his posture, ears forward but not flat, weight distributed evenly, tail static, not enraged, not panicked, holding. She walked toward him. Leila. The charge nurse, Lester, called from the station. Nursing board says wait for animal control. She didn't stop. She moved to a distance of about 8 feet from the dog and crouched down, making herself smaller, and she looked at him the way you look at something you understand rather than something you fear. The dog's eyes tracked her, his weight shifted, barely, but she saw it. She said 5 words. Low, even, in a specific tonal register she hadn't used in 3 years, a phrase that existed in no civilian database and that she'd carried in her memory the way some people carry phone numbers, because you don't forget the language of a post you've shared with an animal in a place where the stakes were everything. The dog sat down. Not slowly, not reluctantly. He sat the way soldiers stand down when the right officer gives the right command. Completely, without residual tension, without any of the wariness you'd expect from an animal that had held an entire trauma bay at a standstill for 19 minutes. Every person in that room went quiet. Leila was already moving toward the gurney. She'd been at Ridgeline for 11 months, and she'd been careful during all of them. She knew what she looked like from the outside, a trauma nurse with solid skills and a quiet manner, someone who worked nights without complaint. She moved a little slower than her instincts told her to. She let attendings make the calls she'd already made in her own head. She asked confirming questions she didn't need the answers to, because the answers weren't the point. Fitting inside the frame was the point, and she'd spent 11 months trying to fit inside a frame that was 2 sizes too small. The first time she stopped trying was 6 weeks in, when the man in Bay 4 had a respiratory presentation that everyone else was reading as anxiety. She stood at the foot of his bed for 12 seconds and counted things. The angle of his neck, the slight rise differential between his left and right shoulders, a subtle cyanosis developing at the nail beds, and she pressed the call button for the attending, Dr. Conrad Ellison, and told him what she thought they were looking at. Ellison had looked at her the way experienced physicians look at nurses who redirect them on cases they've already assessed. He'd come down anyway. 12 minutes later, the patient was in surgery for a bilateral hemothorax that would have killed him before morning. Afterward, Ellison had stopped by the station. How did you know? The presentation didn't track with the complaint, she'd said. His breathing pattern on the right side was compensating. It usually does in the first hour. Ellison studied her for a moment, That's a very specific observation for someone without a surgical background on file. She'd looked at her chart and hadn't answered. The second time was 4 weeks after that, when a man brought in on a domestic dispute call had worked himself up to a level that cleared the hallway and rendered 3 staff members functionally immobile. He was large, mid-50s, with the kind of bulk that came from years of physical labor, and he'd already separated from his restraints twice when Leila picked up her chart, set it down, and walked toward Bay 9 without being asked. She spent 9 minutes talking to him, sat on a stool in the far corner of the bay, kept her posture loose, and spoke in a low, unhurried voice about nothing in particular until his breathing slowed and the urgency went out of his hands. Afterward, the security guard asked how she'd done it. Being afraid and looking afraid are 2 different things, she said. You can be one without being the other. She picked up her chart and went back to work. 11 months. And then Marion Bast called her in on a Wednesday afternoon, and the careful frame she'd built around herself began to come apart. Bast ran nursing operations from a 3rd-floor office designed to communicate authority. Desk positioned slightly forward of center, chairs that placed visitors at a particular angle, framed credentials arranged in a hierarchy facing outward toward the room rather than toward the person who'd earned them. Leila had been in enough command debriefs to recognize environmental staging. She sat down without remarking on it. The folder on Bast's desk was already open. Your licensure is current, Bast said, setting her fingertips on the edge of the folder without looking at it. Your clinical record here has been exemplary in outcomes. A pause. It's the gaps I need to address. Leila waited. Your employment history prior to nursing school has approximately 6 years that isn't accounted for in standard documentation. When staff at your level demonstrate the kind of pattern assessment and patient management you've demonstrated here, it raises questions about prior training we don't have on file. Bast looked at her steadily. Several physicians have brought this to my attention, not as a complaint, as a concern about transparency. My credentials are current, my nursing license is active. That's not in question. The question is what's not in the file. Leila understood then. This wasn't policy. This was discomfort wearing policy's clothing. She'd been outperforming people who'd had more time to establish themselves as the experts in the room, and the room didn't know what to do with that. I'll submit a full supplemental history within 5 days, she said. She stood and left without elaborating. In the elevator, she breathed through her nose, 3 counts in, 3 counts out, the way she'd been taught to breathe when the situation required presence without reaction. The history existed. It was real. It just wasn't something she'd intended to put in a civilian employment file. 6 years, 2 months, and 9 days of service. Army. Special Forces Medical Sergeant 18D, 2 deployments across 2 theaters, a classified direct action operation in her 4th year that she could describe only in its broadest terms, a medical separation in her final year following a non-combat injury, the commendations she'd been awarded, including one that had never been officially processed, for reasons she'd spent 3 years trying not to think about. She ran into Calvin Stroud in the parking structure that night. Stroud worked hospital security. He was in his late 40s with a stillness of movement that she'd clocked in her first week and recognized without deciding to, the way you recognize an accent from a place you've been. Former military. The recognition was involuntary and absolute. He was leaning against a pillar with a coffee cup, not doing anything, which meant he'd been waiting. "Rough meeting," he said. Word gets around. In this building, everything does. He straightened and kept his hands visible. 8 years with 3rd Special Forces Group. I know how an 18 series moves. I've been watching you since your 3rd week. She didn't confirm it. She didn't need to. Bast is going to push until she gets an answer she can file, he said. You know that. I know. What are you going to do? She picked up her bag. Figure it out. He let her go, but as she walked to her car, she heard him say quietly, "Whatever you're carrying doesn't make you a liability. It makes you exactly what this place needs." She submitted the history 5 days later. All of it. The enlistment, the training pipeline, the deployments, the units, The classified engagements described only in the terms clearance allowed, the separation, the commendations. She sealed it in an envelope and left it with Bast's assistant on a Monday morning before her shift. By Thursday, she knew it had been read. She knew because people who'd consulted her casually now did so in lowered voices. She knew because Ellison stopped stopping by the station. She knew because the building had that particular feeling buildings get when something invisible becomes visible, and no one knows quite how to stand in relation to it. Friday evening, an inbox message from Bast. Please come to my office at the start of Monday's shift. She understood what Monday meant. She'd understood since the Wednesday meeting. She went for a run Saturday morning, before the sun cleared the mountains, out along the county road where the only sound was her own breathing and the occasional scatter of gravel underfoot. She thought about what it meant to keep outrunning something that always found its own way back. She didn't have an answer. What she had instead, when she returned and was stretching on her porch steps, was a phone call from a number she didn't recognize. She answered it. Is this Leila Crowe? The voice was male, formal mid-50s, with the flat command register that didn't come from civilian experience. This is Captain Bryce Adele, calling on behalf of Colonel Orrin Dantry, retired. He was transported to Ridgeline Regional approximately 20 minutes ago following a vehicle accident. He's critical. A pause. His Dutch Shepherd is with him. We're told the dog has the trauma bay locked down. Nobody's been able to get to the colonel. She went very still on her porch steps. What's the dog's name? She asked. Juno. The name landed like something she'd carried without knowing she'd carried it. She'd worked alongside military working dogs across 2 deployments. One of them, a Dutch Shepherd with a black mask and a scar behind his left ear from a fragment wound, had been assigned to a direct action unit she'd been embedded with in her 3rd year. The dog in front of her now, if it was the same animal, would recognize the protocol phrase. And if it wasn't the same animal, the conditioning chain would still hold, because that was how military working dog programs were built. I'll be there in 14 minutes, she said. She hung up and drove. The scene she walked into was controlled deterioration. 2 security officers at the bay entrance, not moving. A corporal in civilian clothes on the phone outside the doors. The paramedics still in the corridor with the blank expression of people who'd had a very bad half hour. Through the bay doors, she could see everything she needed to see. The colonel, pale and motionless, monitors partially attached. Someone had gotten close enough for that much before the situation locked down. The nurses and the resident positioned at the room's far edge. And Juno, stationed between the gurney and the room, holding a perimeter that no one had been able to breach for 19 minutes. She said 5 words. Juno sat. She pulled on gloves and moved to the gurney. The resident, Ortega, moved up beside her with the cautious velocity of someone who'd been waiting for permission to function. BP is dropping, he said. Suspected splenic lac on transport. Something else, too. She pressed her gloved hand against the colonel's lower right quadrant. Read the resistance, the warmth, a subtle firmness that didn't belong to the presenting injury. Right side lower. Something's expanding. She looked at Ortega. Page Dr. Mel to the trauma bay. Full abdominal CT expedited. I want a surgical consult before imaging if she can get here. Dr. Constance Mel arrived in 4 minutes. She was 53, silver-haired, with the specific economy of motion that came from decades of operating under pressure. She took in the scene in a single sweep, pressed her own gloved hands against the colonel's abdomen in the places Leila indicated, and her expression didn't change. Imaging, she said to the room, now. The CT confirmed it 40 minutes later. The spleen was lacerated, significant and real, but what sent Mel into controlled urgency was a second bleed, a retroperitoneal hemorrhage on the right side, partially masked by the primary injury, actively expanding. Without intervention in the next window, the colonel's pressure would drop past the point of easy recovery. You called it before imaging, Mel said, pulling up the scans. I felt it. Mel looked at her for a long moment. Scrub in. Leila hesitated for exactly the span of time it took her to acknowledge what she was about to do, and then she followed Dr. Mel to the OR. She was not the surgeon. She managed lines and tracked vitals and anticipated instrument requests with the kind of attentiveness that comes from working in environments where the person handing you things is doing it under conditions that don't allow for hesitation. She caught a pressure reading before it escalated. She flagged an instrument count discrepancy before closure. A retractor sponge displaced behind the lateral wall, and the room stopped for 38 seconds while it was confirmed. She was right. Nobody in that OR asked whether she was supposed to be there. The surgery was 2 hours and 6 minutes. When it was over and the colonel was in the ICU stable, Mel stripped her gloves at the scrub sink and said without looking at her directly, "Where were you before nursing school?" "Army Special Forces, 6 years. Mel was quiet for a moment. "When administration comes for you, and they will, do you want someone in your corner?" Leila looked at her. The offer was direct and genuine. Mel was not a soft person. She offered things once. "Let's make sure he wakes up first," Leila said. "Then we'll talk about corners." The board meeting was called for Monday morning. 8 people in the large conference room. Bast, Dr. Mel, Dr. Edmund Player, the colonel's personal physician, who'd flown in from Phoenix with 4 hours of updated briefing on his phone, 2 state nursing oversight representatives, the hospital attorney Burton Felt, and 2 board members, including Genevieve Ord, whose name Leila had seen on the lobby wall and nowhere else. Felt opened with procedural concerns, outside scope of practice, civilian credential gaps, an 18D with classified history embedded in a civilian trauma role without full administrative disclosure. Mel said the patient was alive because of decisions Leila had made in a window where the procedural options were insufficient. Dr. Player said he'd been treating Orrin Dantry for 11 years, and what Leila had identified, a partially occult retroperitoneal bleed in a patient with a competing primary injury, was not a nursing school skill set. It was the product of experience that got people killed before they developed it. The nursing board representatives wrote in their folders and said careful things. And then Genevieve Ord set both hands flat on the table and said, in a voice that occupied the room the way a heavy door closing occupies a room, "The question from the board's perspective is not what this nurse did wrong. The question is how an institution with this nurse on its trauma floor for 11 months failed to understand what it had. That's the structural failure we should be examining." Felt looked at her. "Genevieve." "Our patient is alive," Ord said. "That's the fact we're working from." The meeting shifted after that. It didn't end cleanly, but it shifted. Leila left the conference room at 4:47 p.m. and went back to the floor. At 5:09, Stroud texted her, "Your attorney filed a complaint with the state nursing board at 4:22 p.m. Before the meeting ended, he had the paperwork ready." She stopped walking in the middle of the corridor. Felt had filed the complaint before Ord shut down the disciplinary path. He'd been moving toward it regardless of how the board responded. Whatever Leila's presence at this facility meant to his calculation of institutional risk exposure, he'd decided to handle it through a channel the board hadn't authorized. She texted back, "How do you know?" The answer came in 11 seconds. "The colonel's office does not appreciate people removing the medical personnel keeping him alive. Turns out that's an operational concern for certain parties." That night, a federal agent named Colm Breslin met her in the family consultation room off the lobby. He was compact, mid-40s, with the particular flat attention of someone who delivered information as a professional practice. He told her the vehicle accident that had brought Dantry in was not an accident. Federal investigators had reached that conclusion within 8 hours of the incident. He told her Dantry had spent the last decade in an interagency advisory role that didn't appear in public records and didn't end cleanly when the uniform came off. He told her the individuals responsible for the incident had identified Ridgeline Regional as Dantry's planned facility for a medical evaluation scheduled 3 months out, and that they had been aware, 6 weeks in advance, that she worked there. "They knew my background," Leila said. "Someone who understood Dantry's medical history and protocol understood you were the one person in this building who could keep him alive if something went wrong." Breslin's voice stayed even throughout, the way a weather report stays even. The complaint Felt filed was part of the same effort. He was approached, provided with information about your background, offered a consulting arrangement contingent on finding a regulatory pathway to remove you from this facility. She looked at the wall. He didn't fully understand what he was part of, Breslin said. He believed he was managing institutional liability. He was being used. Arrests? 24 to 48 hours. She sat with it for a moment. Then she went back to her shift. At 8:47 p.m., the ICU monitor for Bay 4 alarmed in a way her nervous system registered before her conscious mind translated it. She took the stairs. She came through the ICU doors to find Dantry and VTAC, the cardiac display showing a waveform that was immediately, unambiguously wrong. Lester was a step behind her. The crash cart was being pulled from the station. Dr. Player was 3 floors away. She was running the differential as she crossed the room. Autonomic instability in post-surgical anesthesia recovery. Player had flagged it in his chart notes the morning he arrived. A documented pattern in Dantry's surgical history, a tendency toward arrhythmia in the recovery window following general anesthesia. She'd read the note twice. She'd committed it because that was what she did with information that might matter at the worst possible moment. She reached for the IV line. The door opened. Marion Bast came in first. Behind her, 2 individuals in professional clothing with lanyards Leila couldn't read from across the room, and behind them, barely visible in the doorway, a young man with a camera. Nurse Crowe. Bast's voice had the quality of someone delivering a prepared statement. The State Nursing Oversight Office has issued a temporary administrative hold on your clinical authorization pending the outcome of tonight's review. You are instructed to step back from the patient. Juno made a sound from the corner of the room. Not a bark. Something lower, sustained, the kind of sound a trained animal makes when it has been taught to recognize that something is wrong. Leila looked at the monitor. She looked at Dantry, whose eyes were open and fixed on the ceiling with the glass-eyed concentration of a man who was present but not fully certain for how long. She looked at Bast. He's in VTAC, she said. His physician documented an intervention protocol for exactly this presentation. I'm going to follow it. Nurse Crowe, I am giving you a direct. She pushed the magnesium sulfate into the line. 2 grams slow IV push, the way Player's note had specified. Lester stood beside her with the crash cart and the particular focused stillness of a man who had chosen, in less than a second, which judgment he was following. The monitor continued its alarm. Leila kept her eyes on the waveform. She counted. The magnesium worked the way magnesium worked in autonomic-mediated arrhythmia, not immediately, not cleanly, but steadily, the resistance giving way the way a fever breaks. At the 51-second mark, the rhythm began to regularize. At 90 seconds, it held. She stepped back from the line and watched the waveform for another 30 seconds to confirm it, because she did not trust the first sign of stabilization enough to release her attention from it before she was certain. Then she turned around. Bast was still in the doorway. The oversight representatives were behind her. The young man had lowered the camera, or had he? It was difficult to tell from across the room. He's stable, she said. Get Dr. Player down here. Lester was already on the phone. Leila looked at the oversight representatives. Whatever you need to document, do it outside this room. The video went live at 6:14 the following morning. Regional news first, then national aggregators within 2 hours. The young man in the doorway had not been documentation staff for the oversight office. He was a freelance journalist who'd been tipped about an emergency nursing complaint filed against a nurse connected to a high-profile patient under unusual circumstances, and he'd been in the building when it happened and had recorded the whole thing from the moment Bast walked through the door. The headline across every platform was a variation on the same sentence. Nurse ordered to stand down saves patient's life. Full video. The view count crossed 200,000 before Leila finished her shift. Genevieve Ord called an emergency board meeting at noon. Felt had resigned by 10 a.m. The State Nursing Oversight Office suspended the emergency hold within 6 hours of the video's release, pending a full review of the circumstances under which it had been initiated. Breslin called at 2 p.m., 2 arrests, federal jurisdiction, the immediate threat to Dantry's safety neutralized. The colonel was sitting up when she came to the ICU that evening. Not fully, elevated by the bed, pillows behind him, but his eyes were clear, and the color had come back into his face, and Juno was at the foot of the bed with his head resting on his paws in the specific posture of an animal that has decided the emergency is over. Dantry looked at her for a long moment. "You're Crowe," he said. "I work here. Stanton told me what you did." He meant Corporal Rhea Stanton, the military escort who'd been making calls since the moment the 5 words were said and the dog sat down. "Said you walked into a locked trauma bay and said whatever it is you say, and the dog stood down. I knew the protocol. You knew it because you were attached to a unit that ran working dog operations in the Eastern Theater." His voice was rough from the intubation but direct. "I had your service file pulled this morning, the version that got suppressed." He looked at the ceiling. "There was a direct action operation in your 4th year, an extract that got compromised. A 4-person medical element holding a position while the secondary vehicle came in." A pause. "The after-action report named a call sign, not a real name. I had it pulled because the officer who buried it was burying something that deserved recognition." The room went very quiet. Juno lifted his head and looked at her. "They didn't process the commendation," Dantry said, "because processing it would have required acknowledging the operational details, and there were people above the unit who didn't want that engagement on record. I argued for it. I lost." He looked at his hands. "I've been losing arguments about the right thing since 2019, and I'm tired of it." She stood in the particular silence of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time, and has just felt the weight of it registered out loud. "Rest," she said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. "We can talk about this when you're stronger." He looked at her like he was going to push. Then something settled in his face. "All right," he said, "but Crowe." "Yes. We will talk." She left the room and went to the supply room at the end of the unit and stood with her back against a shelf of sterile packaging and breathed 4 times, slow and deliberate, through her nose. Then she went back to work. The board met again 3 days later, smaller this time, just Ord and 2 other board members, Bast and Dr. Mel, and Ord said what she said with the directness of someone who had spent the preceding 72 hours making decisions rather than deferring them. "We failed a basic institutional function," she said. "We had a nurse with combat medicine training and 6 years of special forces experience working night trauma shifts, and our response when her capability became visible was to treat it as a compliance problem." She looked at Leila. "We want to build something here that uses what you actually bring rather than spending energy trying to manage it." She described the proposal. A dedicated unit for veterans and active military patients, designed around the specific medical realities that combat service created. The blast exposure sequelae, the autonomic patterns, the treatment history that standard civilian intake forms weren't built to capture. A unit staffed and led by people who understood those realities from the inside. "We want you to run it," Ord said. Leila looked at the table. She thought about 11 months of careful calibration. She thought about the way she'd moved slowly on purpose, asked confirming questions she didn't need, stood back when she could see exactly what needed to happen. She thought about what it meant to have spent 6 years becoming someone who could do what she'd done in that trauma bay, and that OR and that ICU, and then spend 11 months trying to be smaller than that. The skills and the exhaustion hadn't been separate things. They'd come from the same place. You couldn't put one down without losing the other, and she'd been trying, and it had never worked, and the last 4 days had been the most visible version of a failure she'd been repeating quietly for almost a year. The past didn't stay behind you. It was what you were made of. "Yes," she said. Dantry was discharged 17 days later to a rehabilitation facility with the appropriate protocols and supervision. Juno rode in the transport vehicle. Leila was there for the last part of the discharge because he'd asked her to be. He was in the mandatory wheelchair, looking considerably better than the man who'd arrived on a gurney, which was a lower bar than it sounded but was still real. Color in his face. Eyes fully present. The deliberate quality of a man managing pain as a discipline. The commendation paperwork cleared this morning, he said. She'd heard from Stanton 4 days earlier that the process had been initiated. Your service record has been corrected. The operational details that were suppressed have been restored and cross-referenced with the commendation. It's not public. Parts of it can't be, but it's accurate now. What you did is in the record the way it should have been 7 years ago. She looked at the discharge bay doors. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me, it was owed. He got into the vehicle. Juno followed, loading with the practiced ease of a working dog who had been in and out of vehicles his entire professional life. At the door, Dantry looked back at her. Stop running from what you are, he said. Not as a judgment. As a fact, the way he said everything. You spent 6 years becoming someone who could do what you did in that trauma bay. Running from it doesn't erase it. It just wastes it. The vehicle pulled out into the Harlan County morning, which was bright and cold and indifferent in the specific way of high-altitude mornings that don't adjust themselves for anyone's grief or relief. Juno was visible for a moment through the rear window. Then they turned, and they were gone. 3 months later, she received a package through official channels. Inside was her service record as updated. She'd been told it was coming. Seeing it was different from knowing it was coming. She sat at her kitchen table and read through it, the restored operational details, the accurate accounting of what had happened in that forward position 7 years ago, the commendation at the end of the entry, signed by an authority with the standing to make it permanent. Below the commendation, in the notes field, someone had added a line that was not official language, just a sentence. She held together every person in that position. The record should have always said so. She didn't know who had written it. It might have been Dantry. It might have been someone in his office, or someone further back in the chain who'd worked on the restoration and had wanted to say something that the formal language couldn't contain. It didn't matter who had written it. It was true. That was what mattered. She put the document in the top drawer of her desk, not buried, not hidden, just set aside in the specific way you set aside things that are part of you but don't need to be displayed to be real. Then she made coffee, and she drank it while it was still hot, and she sat at her kitchen table in the Harlan County morning and thought about the distance between what you are and what the world decides to see. The world had spent 11 months deciding she was a procedural gap, a set of credentials that didn't quite add up, a liability in the frame of an institution that had no category for what she'd actually been. It had built a file around her and scheduled a meeting and allowed an attorney to file a complaint before the ink on the board discussion was dry, and it had sent 2 state representatives to the doorway of an ICU bay where a man was dying and told her to step back. She had not stepped back. Not to prove something, not to make a statement. She had not stepped back because a man she'd been asked to care for needed care, and the thing standing between him and that care was a piece of administrative paper, and she had looked at the paper and looked at the monitor and made the only decision she could actually live with. That was all of it. Calvin Stroud transferred to the unit's security coordination team, which existed officially as a line item under specialized patient safety protocols, and which practically meant he showed up every morning with the same thermos and the same steady manner and understood, without being told, what the unit actually needed from him. The Veteran Trauma Integration Unit opened 6 weeks after Dantry's discharge. The first patient they received was a 59-year-old man, a former Army combat engineer, whose post-surgical complications had baffled 2 hospitals in 3 months, because no one on his care teams had thought to ask about the blast exposure he'd sustained in his final deployment, or what 3 years of TBI sequelae looked like when it compounded with post-anesthesia stress response. Leila asked about it in the first 20 minutes of his intake. The answer changed the entire management plan. She thought about what Dantry had said in the discharge bay. Veterans are not complicated patients. They're patients whose experiences created specific medical realities that most civilian systems don't have the framework to address. She had the framework. She used it. The unit had 14 patients by the end of its 4th week, 9 of them had documented histories that prior care teams had not adequately incorporated into their treatment plans. 3 had been misdiagnosed. 1 had spent 2 years without anyone understanding why her symptoms presented the way they did, until Leila spent 40 minutes in her room asking questions that started not with "what are your symptoms," but with "where were you?" and what happened there. She understood the answer before it was finished. She understood the way you understand things you didn't learn from textbooks, from the inside out, from the lived texture of what it actually was. That understanding was not a weight she'd been carrying. It had always been the point. She drove to Ridgeline each morning through the mountain cold, badged in, checked the unit census, reviewed the overnight notes, answered questions, and walked the halls of a floor she had built from scratch in the space between what the institution had tried to make her and what she actually was. At the end of one of those mornings, she stopped at the window at the far end of the corridor, the one that faced east where the mountains were highest and the light came in first. She stood there for a moment, not thinking, just present, taking in the specific ordinary silence of a place that had, against several people's best efforts, become somewhere she belonged. Then she turned around, walked to the first room on her morning rounds, and said, "Good morning. Tell me how you're doing." And she meant it the way she meant everything, completely, without performance, with the full attention of someone who has learned the hard way that the moment in front of you is the only one you can be certain of. The patient looked at her and started talking. She listened. That was where it started every time. Not with the commendation, not with the video, not with the board meetings or the federal arrests or the administrative hold that got suspended and the attorney who lost his license. It started here, in a room, with a person who needed someone to understand what they were carrying and another person who did. That was the job. That had always been the job. She was finally doing it as her whole self. And her whole self, it turned out, was more than enough.